The old road was gone by the time anyone looked for it, paved over by years or perhaps memory. The kind of memory that sours in the bones of old men and hides behind the eyes of widows. When someone finally asked about it in the autumn of 1922, a man with a hollow voice said, "That road never truly existed," but others remembered. They remembered how, back in the brutal winter of 1873, it led into a fold of hills known then as Orison, a name whispered in the breath between prayer and silence. Orison was not a town, not really, just a pocket of cabins clustered where the coal veins ran deep and the snow piled deeper. 7 children lived there then, scattered across 3 coal families. They played with stones and whispered to trees and giggled in the frost-lined hollows near the frozen river. They made little dolls of straw and bone. They sang lullabies no one taught them and clapped to rhythms older than song. They were happy, or at least that's how the stories go. But something else lived there too. Something older than the coal. Older than the pines. Something that watched from the birch, stands with breath like fog, and eyes that never closed. And by the time the thaw came in spring, none of the children remained. No one spoke of the disappearance aloud, not in the summer that followed, not even when the laughter stopped echoing through the trees. Some said wolves, some whispered frostbite. Others claimed the families simply left in the night, suitcases dragging through the snow without a sound. But those who'd been there, those who'd seen the children last, knew better. Mrs. Elora Kinley, the widow in the last cabin before the woods, swore she saw them the night before they vanished, standing in a perfect circle beneath the oldest birch, the one with the split trunk and the hollow heart. She said they were humming, a low, droning hum that made her windows vibrate. And she wasn't alone. Others remembered the same sound, the same pressure in the air like a storm that never broke. The Coleman said it was nothing. The parson said it was pagan nonsense. The sheriff rode out, looked at the empty beds, the small shoes left behind, the drawings etched into the soot of the hearths, and said, "They'll turn up." But they didn't. Not after one day. Not after a week. Not after the fall returned, and with it, that same hollow hum in the trees. By winter the town had started to come undone. Lanterns flickered with no wind to shake them, doors swelled shut, though no frost touched the hinges, and at night the dogs howled, not at the moon, but toward the church steeple where the bell rang once at midnight, though no hand pulled its rope. The lake froze differently that year, not in gentle sheets of glassy blue, but in jagged cracks that spiraled outward like veins, like fractures in bone. And at the center, a single shape beneath the ice. A child's mitten, red, too bright, untouched by rot, as if time had stopped for it alone. Mr. Bramley tried to retrieve it, but the ice would not break. No matter how hard he struck, his axe glanced off like stone. Some said the lake had taken its own, had turned sacred, cursed, or something older still. And every night since the disappearance, Elora Kinley said she heard footsteps on her roof. Not birds, not branches, but heavy snow-muffled steps pacing, until dawn broke and the weight lifted like breath drawn back into the dark. In February, the whispers began, low at first like wind curling under doors, but clearer each night, forming words no one wanted to understand. Elias Grigg, the old beekeeper, claimed he woke to find his hives humming with voices, not bees. And when he opened one, it was empty except for a child's shoe, still warm, still damp, as if it had just been removed. His wife said he never spoke again after that, just sat on the porch muttering numbers that didn't exist, like coordinates to nowhere. And then there were the mirrors. Every pane in Cold Hollow started reflecting things that weren't there. A woman brushing her hair where no one stood. A man in a black hat walking into rooms that remained locked from within. A baby's cry from inside a sealed trunk in the attic of the parsonage. Old Mrs. Darrow covered every mirror in black cloth and said it was the only way to keep the past from walking forward into the present. But by the 3rd week, every cloth was gone. Every reflection looked back wrong. They found the preacher's dog hung upside down from the steeple, the rope braided from what looked like hair, not human, but coarser, wet, smelling of rain and grave moss. No one spoke of it aloud, not even when the preacher himself went missing the next morning. His shoes still on the porch, his dinner untouched, his Bible open to a page that had been torn out from every other copy in town. Some said he walked into the river and was swallowed without a ripple, but others swore they saw him at night lurking behind the fence of the old schoolhouse, smiling without eyes. Children began drawing shapes they couldn't explain. Circles with roots, triangles filled with weeping mouths, their little fingers stained black with charcoal, even though their parents never gave them any. One girl spoke a language no one recognized and screamed when her tongue was touched, as if it burned. Every night more birds fell from the sky, feathers stiff, eyes hollow, as though something above had stopped watching, and something else had started. The gravedigger stopped digging. His hands, once calloused and sure, now trembled with each scoop of earth. He claimed the ground was resisting, refusing to part, as if the dead had clawed upward and held it shut. One evening, he vanished, his shovel still stuck in the soil, slick with something darker than mud. The townsfolk heard humming from the empty graves, low and off-key, like a lullaby sung by something with no mouth. The air grew thick with rot, though no bodies turned, and at midnight the church bell rang by itself, 14 times, though the town's clock was broken and the bell tower empty. Those who listened too long to the sound said they saw shapes in the fog, tall figures made of branches and ash, drifting just outside their windows, scratching the glass but never breaking through. An old widow covered her mirrors with sheets, saying her reflection moved when she didn't, smiling long after she'd stopped. Her house was later found empty except for dozens of mirrors, all uncovered and all cracked from the inside. The baker's boy was the first to return from the woods, though no one had sent him there. His mouth was sewn shut with black thread, and his eyes had turned completely white, like eggs boiled too long. He wandered into the square barefoot, his skin pale and damp like something just pulled from a river. No one dared touch him. He stood in silence for hours, then began to hum, the same off-key tune that came from the empty graves. People began to forget their names, staring into fire as though waiting for it to speak. The mayor locked himself in his office and wrote the same word over and over on every page of a ledger. Underneath, underneath, underneath. Then he vanished, his chair still warm, his coffee half drunk. The town's dogs stopped barking and sat at doorways, watching the shadows move across ceilings even when no lights were on. At night, a sound like a heartbeat echoed beneath the floorboards, and the children began to say things in their sleep, things no child should know, things in voices not their own. The night air grew heavy, thick with a smell like iron and damp stone, as if something ancient had been unearthed and left to rot. The trees surrounding the village bent inward, silent, watchful, closing ranks as though to hide something within. The blacksmith's forge grew cold, though no wind passed through and his tools wept rust overnight. Children pointed to cracks in the walls that hadn't been there the day before, cracks that widened when no one looked directly at them. The sound of dripping water echoed through dry rooms, and the wallpaper began to peel in long curling strips, revealing words etched beneath in a language no one claimed to know. A woman who tried to leave returned within minutes, her hair turned white, her fingernails bleeding, unable to speak except in whispers that made birds fall from the sky. Old clocks rang at impossible hours, striking 13, then pausing, then sobbing. A boy drew a circle in the dirt and sat inside it for days, claiming it was the only place left where the voices couldn't crawl into him. No one dared erase it. And then came the fog, not like before, but a thick, oil-slick veil that slithered through cracks and under doors, coating windows from the inside. It moved with intention, with memory, with something older than language. The church bell rang by itself, slow, off-tempo, like it was drowning. A man found his reflection waving back at him, even when he stood still. A baby was born with eyes already closed, and when it cried, the sound came out in reverse. Trees split from the inside as if trying to escape their own bark. Birds flew backward over the sky, and every path twisted into another, looping endlessly, dragging those who walked them into circles until their footprints vanished. Every night someone different forgot their own name, and by morning, they weren't the same shape anymore. Milk soured inside sealed bottles, mirrors stopped showing faces, and those who dared to dream woke up with soil under their nails and dew clinging to their lashes, as if they'd been somewhere else, somewhere damp and watching. The boy came back, but he wasn't the boy anymore. He wore his skin like a borrowed coat, loose in places, tight in others, and when he blinked, it wasn't always in sync with the rest of him. He spoke names no one had told him, names that hadn't been uttered in Cold Hollow for generations, and when asked where he had gone, he simply whispered, "Underneath." He would stare at corners with too much interest, as if corners were doors, and sometimes he would hum a tune that made dogs whimper and glass tremble. His mother tried to hold him once, but her arms passed through like he was only sometimes there. The townspeople gathered, watching him from behind lace curtains and cracked blinds, whispering stories their grandparents never dared speak aloud, about the ones who vanished and came back hollow-eyed, about the pact made under the crooked tree long before Cold Hollow had a name. Still, the boy smiled when it rained, and frogs followed him like loyal pets, and sometimes he would speak to shadows, and they would answer in voices not meant for this world. The town began to rot from the inside the moment the boy returned. Floors creaked beneath feet that weren't there. Mirrors fogged up with breathless whispers and wrote backward words no one could read aloud without choking on dust. The church bell rang at midnight, but no one pulled the rope, and in the woods the trees leaned in, closer each day, their roots clawing toward the town like fingers in the dark. Every morning, one more house stood empty, but no one remembered it ever being filled. And those who stayed began to forget things, their children's names, the sound of their own voice, the taste of bread. The boy walked through all of it, unchanged, untouched, a lantern in his hand that flickered blue instead of gold. He'd stop at doorsteps and listen, head tilted, as if hearing voices beneath the floorboards. Then he'd smile and keep walking. The mayor tried to speak to him once, but before he could finish his sentence, he aged 10 years in a blink and crumbled into ash. And still the boy smiled, his eyes shimmering with something that was not joy. They began to dig, half from desperation, half from memory that wasn't theirs. Men with blistered hands and cracked fingernails clawed through dirt behind barns and under schoolyards. The ground was softer in certain places, as if it had already been turned centuries ago. They found things that didn't belong to them but carried their names etched in bone. A wedding ring on a finger that was not their wife's. A child's shoe with no wear, but soaked in tears that had dried long before their children were born. The boy never spoke. He only watched, his head always slightly turned, as if listening to another world whispering just beneath the one everyone else walked on. And sometimes, if the wind was cruel enough, you could hear the whispers too. Sentences that ended with your name. Babies stopped crying in their cribs, but only because they stared into corners, unblinking. The dogs stopped barking, then they stopped breathing, and no one remembered having dogs at all. The maps of the town began to change themselves. Old roads reappeared, new ones disappeared, and at the very center, where no road led anymore, stood the boy, waiting. He stood in the place where the town had once been born, where the first stone had been laid and the first blood had been spilled. There was no plaque, no memory carved into oak or marble, just the boy, and the silence that bowed to him like wind through graveyard grass. His shadow stretched in directions that didn't match the sun, sometimes bending sideways, sometimes rising straight up like a flag unwilling to fall. They came to him now, without knowing why. Women who had lost children in their sleep. Men who couldn't find their fathers in family photographs. Old ones who dreamed of a house they'd never lived in, but missed anyway. He said nothing. Still, but the earth around him breathed differently when he was near. The air smelled of paper and fire, of soil and bone, and sometimes of the perfume of someone you loved once and buried without realizing. And every night at the same hour, Even the clocks refused to tick. The town no longer knew what day it was. Some thought it had always been autumn. Some thought it had never been born. The boy watched them all, tilted his head again, listening to what none of them could hear, and waited for the last name to be spoken. There were whispers now, not just in dreams, but in the cracks between waking moments, in the pause between footsteps, in the breath before a door creaks open. The boy walked the streets that had forgotten their names, where the signs had peeled off and left only outlines like ghosts of words too afraid to stay. He passed by homes no longer lived in but never truly empty. Windows blinked when no one looked. Shadows gathered not from light but from memory. There was one house, the blue one that used to belong to the Rellards, that still had a child's mobile spinning in the attic, though no wind had touched it in years. It sang lullabies in a tongue that didn't belong to any country, and the boy would stop there, always, as if listening to an old friend he couldn't quite remember. The townspeople no longer questioned it. They had long since stopped asking why their reflections turned away in mirrors, or why their dreams always ended at the same hill, with the same boy standing at the top, back turned, waiting. They had accepted him, not as savior, not as curse, but as something in between, a quiet truth that didn't need to be spoken. And yet every time he passed, a new door would lock, a new name would vanish from the family Bible, as if the town itself was preparing to forget it had ever existed at all. The church bell rang, though no one pulled the rope anymore, and its sound was not one of metal on metal, but something softer, like a breath held too long, then exhaled into dust. The boy walked toward it now, his steps too quiet for gravel, his shadow stretched longer than it should, even with the sun already gone behind clouds that never moved. Inside the chapel, the pews were empty but warm, as if someone had just risen from prayer. The altar cloth had stitched itself into patterns of things no one had taught. Symbols not born from scripture but from soil, from blood, from something deeper than faith. The boy touched nothing, but the walls sighed around him, wood and stone relaxing as if remembering their first form before they were ever shaped into a church. He stood in the aisle where wedding vows had turned to whispers of grief, where funerals had echoed into silence, where names once spoken aloud had long since slipped into the floorboards like spilled water. Everywhere he stepped, the candles flickered not with flame but with flickers of memory, brief and bright, and then gone. Faces of those who had walked this aisle before him, eyes open, then closed, then open again in places they could not describe. The boy breathed in the air that had forgotten how to be air, and in that breath was the taste of the town's first fire, the first scream in its cradle, the last lullaby ever sung before the forgetting began again. You have heard only echoes, yet the truth still hides beneath the skin of this forgotten place where memory bleeds like oil through the cracks in silence, and nothing ever truly leaves, not the cries, not the names, not the boy who walked too far into the chapel, nor the ones who watched from the window that no longer reflects, only absorbs. This was not just a tale. It was a wound. And wounds, remember even when you forget? So listen closely next time you hear a door close in a house you thought was empty or a bell ring. Where no hands remain, for these stories never end. They only drift, waiting for someone like you to hear them again and again and again.